I think I have to leave early. Okay. And what do we have here?
It's an item.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, but it's
Good morning. Let's get started. We'll do a few announcements before Kevin gets here, and then we'll let Kevin go. Kevin's truly a second-year resident because he has to preach today as well as teach today. He already preached. Laura, welcome. He's already preached. Okay.
You did a great job.
It's always a pleasure.
Okay, so let's go through church-wide announcements quickly on this. Do notice? We also let me start two things off. I want to start off the prayer request book around here with Robert, and right behind that is a card for Sarah Stafford. Thank you, Carrie, for bringing that in.
thank you, Carrie.
And so there's one for Sarah. I understand Sarah had a pretty tough night on her first one. We'll talk about that during our prayer request time. What church announcements do we have for us today? Do we have some church-wide ones?
Super Bowl Sunday is
Next Sunday. Next Sunday, okay. So we'll remember that. All right.
Isn't there something on Monday night, a streaming from?
I saw this.
Thursday night.
Thursday night.
Wait, Renee Brown.
Yes.
I read this morning.
I don't
Really good
remember
things
the
about
details. She remembered the details.
It's about how to talk to each
I
other.
don't know that this affects any of your people or friends or whatever, but they just started an Alzheimer's Friends Day out on Friday, so that's
Friday
happening.
Friends.
And the next room in the end is on I believe is it the 19th, 16th?
16th. Of February.
Yeah, so that's we need to be aware of that as well.
I think they're still needing volunteers. I haven't talked to them.
Yeah, I think that's right. So still some are needing. If there's not any more, we'll just turn it immediately over to you, Kevin, and we'll do prayer requests if you'll, about 22 or so. Sure. If you'll,
How's Ken doing?
what's that?
How is Ken doing?
Ken is doing okay, but he still doesn't feel like he needs to be out yet. So we'll go through that. He's doing well, and he appreciates the food that people have brought, and even turned off Kay and I on that particular one because he had relatives that came in to cook. And Nora, we're glad you're here.
Oh,
Glad you're here. Yes. Okay, Kevin, thank you so much.
Well, it's nice to be back with y'all 2 weeks in a row. Look at that. Robert just shared with me a quote that he found today that I want to share with you since we're talking about the Old Testament, specifically Abraham, who is obviously a pretty complicated character. So this is a quote from Don Campbell. The Old Testament is there because there's a great deal of human life, stories of real human beings, men and women who lived in another time, who faced many problems of life as we do, who tried to walk with God, who suffered as we sometimes suffer, who had victories and defeats in their lives. Which I think is a pretty powerful word about, especially the book of Genesis. So last week we talked about Noah and the flood. We didn't get to talk about Tower of Babel. We had such fun talking about Noah and the flood.
That was one thing that Ken made a comment on. He said he saw your Sunday school lesson, and he wished he would have gone into that one because he had several questions.
Oh, good. Well, Ken usually has several questions. But
I'm sure you did.
I did hear something this week that I thought that is a really helpful story for thinking about the Tower of Babel. So I do want to say I'll say one thing about Tower of Babel, which is in Genesis 11, if you want to flip one page ahead. So let's read the Tower of Babel together. And we've got a lot of text today, so we might move through some of it and kind of see what you think, what you see in the Abraham story. So let's start with the Tower of Babel story. Last week we started with Travis. Maybe we could start with Robert. Robert, would you read the first?
Somebody else read.
Oh, somebody else. Okay, now, would you read the first two verses?
Where are we now?
Sorry, Genesis 11. Sorry, Genesis 11. Jim, would you read the first two verses of Genesis 11, and we'll just go around. Kay, you can read two after him.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there.
And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth."
The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them."
Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city.
So the
Let's
Lord
read verse
scattered.
9.
9. That was why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world.
Perfect.
From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Perfect. Okay, now let's pause there, because then we get into the genealogies, which there's a lot there, but you know, it's pretty boring to like read through. And so if you're just reading it out loud, but let's talk about the Tower of Babel, since we didn't really get to that last week, and I think it's an important introduction into the Abram story. So what jumps out at you about this story so far? Like what questions do you have? Things that might that seem odd or strange or puzzling to you about this story on an initial read?
It seems to kind of just pop up out of nowhere.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's such a weird story. And I think when I first heard it, I was like 4, so I don't remember what I thought. I was just like, okay, there's a tower. But the more I started to reflect on it, kind of when I was in seminary and everything, I started wondering, like, why is it a bad thing for humans to work together?
Yes.
Like, isn't that a good thing? Like, don't we build and make and do incredible things when we work together and for projects, you know? Like, so I was always puzzled by that. So my professor Frank Tupper at Wake Forest, he takes the first 11 chapters of Genesis and talks about them. It's called the prehistory, usually. Genesis 1 through 11. But the focus that Dr. Tupper would talk about is how you have the 2 creation narratives, right, which are a little different each, but there are 2 creation stories that tell us something about what God is doing, right? The first creation story is this, reads almost like a poem. I mean, it was actually, a lot of scholars think that it was actually written to be like liturgy. It was meant to be read in worship because there's this rhythm to it, right? The first day, and God said it was good. The second day, and God said it was good. And the third day, and God said it was good, right? There's this rhythm to it. Then the second story is very particular. It's about this character, the Adam, right? Adam is the Hebrew word for a few things. It's the Hebrew word for man, or human, but it's the Hebrew word for dirt, or soil, or earth. And so the Adam is the Adam who's made from the Adam, which is kind of weird to hear. Like, it's like if your name was, if your name was Grace, right? And then your name, we know you as the name Grace, but also we know that Grace means so much more than just you. It's not just your name, right? So, and all of our names mean something, right? So Adam's name means earth, and so it's this, the second creation narrative begins with that Adam. So the story itself, though, then moves to these first 4 sin narratives. And the sin narratives tell us something about humanity and about God's response to our own sinfulness, right? So the first sin, which is, anyone?
Eating from
Yep, Adam and Eve eating the fruit, right? The fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The second sin narrative, anyone?
Is it?
Cain and Abel?
Cain and Abel, yeah, very good. Cain and Abel. Murder. Those don't seem equally weighted, do they? What's the third one? The one we looked at last week.
Well,
Everything all the time was evil in all the earth, I guess.
right.
No, yeah, absolutely. Violence. And then this last one is the Tower of Babel. Now, what's strange about that is what's the sin here? Right? So that's a really great answer to that question. And what's the sin here?
Disobedience.
In another sense, it is disobedience, which comes from, as St. Augustine said, the sin of Adam and Eve is pride.
That's right.
So we actually see the same sin at a personal level and now at a corporate, universal level. We see the same sin at a personal, relational, family level to a universal level, right? So there's this interesting folding that happens with Genesis 1 through 11. But what we see is that everything that was good that God did here and here is no longer good. Everything has gone to a mess. And the Tower of Babel, why is it pride, right? So the question that I kind of wrestle with is, isn't it good that humans work together, right? Like, why would that be a bad thing? But the question, and so I had to kind of put myself. So last week we talked about the cosmology of the ancient world, right? So they believed that the sky was filled with what? Water, right? Because you look up and it's blue. Of course it's full of water, right? The land is here. Now, in the Tower of Babel story, all the humans gather together and they try to build a tower. That's my tower. It's not very sturdy, but it is a tower. So they try to build this tower. And they're trying to get to heaven, right? And so they say, what they actually say in the text is they say, let us make a name for ourselves with its tower at the top of heaven. Now, I have a question for you, and it's not a rhetorical question. I want to answer. How high is the sky? Taller than a tower that I can build? Okay, right. So
It's like a kindergarten question.
right. Right. So God, and I love the way that Genesis does this thing that we call anthropomorphizing, which means to make God look human, right? Genesis uses this very human language to talk about God. And so it says that God comes down. Now the point of that is not to say that God isn't everywhere, right? Because theologically, as Christians on this side of this, we know that God is omnipresent, God is spirit, God is everywhere. God is neither male nor female, but male and female are created in the image of the one God, right? These are things we know now theologically. And in the Genesis narrative, the way they tell the story, though, is they want it to say, that, and God comes down. So the idea is that the tower this is God, which, never draw God. So that's a graven image. I know it's wrong, but I'll do a circle. There you go. So it says that God comes down to see the tower. So there's this joke that's built in it. It's not like that funny of a joke, but if you think about it, it says they're building this tower to make it all the way to heaven. But God, who is everywhere, has to go all the way down just to see this tower that they think is so high, right? And so God confuses their language to send them out. And so what I started wondering is, why would God do that? And I also started wondering, and I think the first time that I went overseas and traveled and got to kind of interact with another culture, was the first time that I realized there was a world a lot bigger than Garland, Texas. Even Dallas, Texas, there's a world even bigger than that. But yeah, and I know you lived in China, but what was that like the first time you entered into another culture that wasn't your own? What did that feel like?
Yeah, my first trip overseas was to London, so even there, the language is the same, but not, everything was, and I was a teenager, so like the first couple days there, I hated it. I was like, I don't know, but it is that sense of, because this first sentence in this story, I'm like, oh, the day that we'd all speak the same language, that would be amazing, because, even on a daily basis, I deal with it here with just people I can't communicate as well with in Spanish.
Yeah.
But it is, but the beauty of experiences, a lot of experiences I've had overseas is that like the language of Jesus, that even though you don't speak the same language, which that's not the point of the story here. Sorry. Anyway, but it is that sense of even though you don't speak the same language, you have the same heart because you're believers,
Yeah. And the Bible story, I think, is not necessarily about us dividing humans against each other. That's something that we do to ourselves. I see it as this invitation to go and explore this beautiful place that God created. There's so much beauty in the world out there to be discovered, and when humans they gather together to build this tower to go up, but how far is up? And are they ever going to be able to go up enough to get to the place where they'll truly be happy? But no, God says, don't go up. Your job is to go out. Like, go out and see everything that I put here for you. And so the narrative closes with that image of humans not trying to go up to, and I think what I kind of read into the text that I think is implied there, is they're not just kind of trying to go up to heaven to be like, hey, look, it's heaven, this is neat. This is an invasion. They're trying to make themselves like God. They're trying to conquer God. And God says, no, don't. You're never going to beat me. You're never going to make a tower tall enough. There's so much more out there for you. There's so many more trees. Go explore. Jerry, I saw your hand go.
I was just thinking about what Diana was saying about being in England, and there's a wonderful, in the Broadway musical, My Fair Lady, one of the opening songs is Why Can't the English Learn to Speak? And the whole song goes through lauding all these other languages, and they teach their children to speak fluently and beautifully, and then it says in America they haven't spoken in years. So, I mean, you do that. Even in different parts of this country, you get this feeling, why can't they be like Jackson? Why can't they speak Texan? So, yeah.
That's so funny. Yeah, and there's this accordion effect that seems to keep happening, right? Between universal and particular. There's this universal picture of the creation in Genesis 1, right? God creates everything that is, and it is good, it is good, it is very good. And God creates the man from the dirt and the woman, and they live in a garden together. There's this bigness. There's this one little family, Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve. Cain kills his brother. The whole world then gets filled with violence. Then the humans in this one particular place are trying to build their tower up to God, and God sends them out. And so once again, we pull back in to a particular point, and that's where we get to the story of Abram, who will become Abraham. So Genesis 12, just turn the page over, and we're going to jump to the story of Abram. My old pastor Steve used to call this this first part of Genesis 12, I loved how he said this. He said, Genesis 12 is the beginning of biblical faith. It's the beginning of the moment where God makes a promise to a particular person, and it is through that person that salvation will come, and that the world that was destroyed by our actions will then become reconciled back into God. All salvation comes through Abram. So let's begin with, let's start at verse 12:1. Where were we? Who was reading last? Oh, there we go, Sandra. Sandra, why don't you read 1 and 2, and then we'll go on through, how much do we have? Okay, we'll go to verse 7.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing.
I will bless those who bless you, and whosoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran.
Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land.
The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev.
Let's pick up this the next story, which is the Abraham and Sarah story. So let's keep reading 10 through 20 there.
Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live.
Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful.
15 to 16.
Okay. When the palisades saw her, they praised her to the king, the Pharaoh, and she was taken into his harem. Then Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her, sheep, oxen, donkeys, men and women, slaves, and camels.
But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?
Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on his way with his wife and all that he had.
That's well. Any reactions to that? There's plenty to react to in that story. I think I probably first heard that story when I was like 5 years old. So I wouldn't exactly say that. It's not even PG-13 really, but any reactions? What did you notice? And particularly about these two parts of the narrative. This kind of grand, soaring, beautiful moment of calling where he's told, I want to make you a blessing to the world. And the people that you bless, I'm going to bless. And the people that curse you, I'm going to curse. So that all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. And then almost immediately, he essentially sells his wife into Pharaoh's harem, right? So what do you notice about that? How do you react to this story we've heard so far?
Abram always has another idea.
Yeah.
Abram likes Plan B.
Yeah, he and this is the point of, I think, a story like this is one for us to not try to whitewash our heroes. We have a tendency to do that. There's a really remarkable theologian named Justo Gonzalez. He wrote kind of the kind of foremost history of Christianity right now that you get assigned in most church history classes. He's a Cuban immigrant was the youngest person to ever get a PhD from Princeton University, which is pretty interesting. And in his book, Mañana, Hispanic Perspective on Christian Theology, he kind of goes through the big theological themes in Christianity, like Trinity, resurrection, incarnation, these kind of the big $5 words in theology, right? And offers and does a very beautiful reading of the biblical text through his experience as a Cuban immigrant. I mean, it's a remarkable book. And one of the things he says is that he says, Latin American Christians, we don't have the same history that U.S. American Christians do. Because your ancestors are the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and you can tell yourself this narrative about this, the religious cause, and we came to America for religious liberty, and you kind of, whitewash the genocide of Native Americans. But he said, but as a Latin American Christian, our ancestors are the conquistadors. The conquistadors, the Spanish explorers who came to the New World in search of blood and treasure. And they were not pretending to be men of religion. They might have dragged a priest along with them to build a monastery somewhere.
To bless them.
A mission, yeah, to bless them. But
to forgive them.
And so Justo Gonzalez talks about, he says that we as Latin American Christians, we can't afford to whitewash our history because it's too in our face. And so when we read the biblical text, we don't have any need to whitewash our heroes the way that U.S. Americans do. And I thought it was so interesting because when I read that, I thought immediately, oh my gosh, like what do we do to Abraham and Noah and Jacob and these characters who, Noah immediately after the Noah story, what's the first thing he does? He builds a vineyard, makes wine, and gets drunk and falls asleep naked. Abraham sells his wife, which is way worse than falling asleep naked while drinking your wine, of course. But and obviously, those are not morally equal things. And then Jacob just kind of cheats his way through life. So if you try to take these characters and say, we should be more like Abraham, well, it's more than the message, and my Old Testament professor, Dr. Frampton, used to say, the only hero of the Old Testament is God. The God of the promise. Because everyone else is human, and humans are flawed. But the good news is, so are we. We're not supposed to be anything other than who we are. And we are continuing to move toward, and the closer that we come to Christ, the closer that we come together, the more that we can become the people that God dreams and knows that we can be, the people of that promise, the people who are called to bless and not curse. But we're human. We make mistakes. And almost immediately in the story, that's what we see, is humans making mistakes.
And sometimes very outlandish ones too. I mean, even the Tower of Babel. Humans, it seems to me, have forever and a day tried to define God on their terms. And you can't do it.
Yeah. Because
God is perfect, and humans have never known perfection.
Yeah. There's a really wonderful medieval mystic named Meister Eckhart. He was a monk, and he had this reflection where he talked about stripping away the layers that we put around God in the things that we believe, and recognizing that wherever he got to, God was always one step beyond that. God is always more mysterious than we could ever imagine. I heard a quote just the other day. It's a Buddhist quote, and the quote was, if you ever meet the Buddha, kill him. And the point being, if somebody comes along to you and say, hey, I'm the enlightened one, listen to me, don't believe them. And I thought, that's interesting to our faith. If somebody walked up to you and was like, I don't want to brag, but I'm actually Jesus Christ, you'd be like, this person's a crazy person, don't listen to them. So yes, God is always that mystery that's just out of reach, but who's reaching out to us. And I think that is what we see in this Abraham story. Abraham couldn't himself connect to God, but that God reached out to him and said, I want to bless you.
So Kevin, part of, like, I'm sitting here struck because I think because I have to go to extended care after this, I'm thinking from a child's perspective. You know, we bring kids to church and we simplify these stories and try to create them in ways that children will understand them, and children, we create the hero complex, right? But how do you weave that in and say, yes, they were heroes, but they weren't, you know, because that's what children's minds can, like, just to get them to understand God and that he's actually not a person is like way out there, you know?
Yeah.
So that, because I think some of that whole, our heroes are whitewashed, if you grow up in the church, that's how you come to learn that, right?
Yeah.
So how do you balance that? Sorry.
I wish I had the answer.
How high is the sky?
On you know, I asked a very similar question once to a friend who's a pastor, my friend Scott Jones. He's a pastor in Omaha, Nebraska now, and I said, you know, and it was around the time I was in college, so I'm kind of reading these stories very differently. And I said, you know, I'm a youth minister at the time. I'm like, how should I talk to youth about this? Or how should I, you know, how do you teach children these stories when they're actually these really pretty scary and tragic stories? And Scott said, you know, he said, I think maybe you just tell the story and you let them ask questions. And, you know, so often we tell a story and we want to immediately interpret it. And I'm really bad about that because I always want to say, well, what does this mean, you know? But sometimes the story itself carries with it the opportunity for questions to be asked. And so with children, maybe that's a way to step into that. Because one of the things I've also realized is that as I've grown, the text hasn't really changed at all, right? It's essentially the same, right? Even you go get a different translation or whatever, it's the text, the stories are still the stories. But the stories are so different to me now than they were when I was a child. And so maybe it's less about how do we tell this story in an appropriate way to a child and more about how do we continue to be faithful to the telling of the story and let that child, as they grow, let them interact with that story over and over again. It's one of the best youth camp series we ever did was I did Genesis 1 through 11. We did the first 4 sin narratives. And the thing that my youth came back and said to me more than anything, our camp pastor was John Jay, if y'all remember John Jay Alvaro, and they kept coming up and saying, this is my favorite series of sermons, my favorite youth camp we've ever done. And I said, really, tell me why. And they said, it's because I've heard these stories 1,000 times, but it feels like I'm hearing them for the first time. So I think if you have enough trust that God will let these stories become new over and over again.
Well,
but I don't know, maybe.
True to point is the fact that not only do you mature as a human being, or supposed to anyway, but also as a Christian. Your Christian goes through your Christianity, I should say, goes through a maturation process on its own.
Yeah.
And you bring children along in the same respect.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also, if I can jump in. So I'm a trauma therapist and I work with kids, and so I talk to kids about horrible things every day. So from that perspective, I think that a lot of times the thing that gets us hung up is really just like our own, like the stigmas that we've sort of inherited and the way that we've been socialized to kind of look at things a certain way or not look at things a certain way. And kids, like, there are a lot of times where I have a conversation with a kid and I expect them to be horrified and they're fine, you know? Because it's just, they haven't they haven't had time to percolate in the idea that like, no, this is something that we don't talk about. This is something that's too terrible. And they're just, people do bad things, and we don't always know why people do bad things, but that's a thing that happens. And kids have much more ease with that than we do, I think.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, so often the moral judgments that we place on stories, a child and somebody else might, even not just a child, but an adult who's maybe new to faith or has been, a Christian their whole life, might not be asking the same questions about the text as we are, And so, when we read the text together, it's always, I love to say, what do you hear in this? And it's interesting sometimes what people come up with, because they notice something that I would have never noticed before. And that's, I don't know, that's one of the beautiful things.
But Kevin, one of the things that seems to, I guess 2 points. One is that they didn't move from the place on the map here, or the Chaldees, up because Sarai wanted a new tent. They did this because they answered the call of God. And so it seems to me that God uses those people who say yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, to me, it is not, I have no way to justify this, but God could have tried to call other people who didn't say yes, but Abraham did.
Yeah, yeah. There's actually in the Catholic tradition, there's a story about. Is it Catholic tradition? I can't remember what tradition it's actually in. But anyway, where when Mary is asked by the angel, by Gabriel, will you give birth to the Son of God? That Mary was not the first woman to be asked, but she was the first one who said yes. I can't remember what tradition teaches that. It probably isn't the Catholic tradition, because they have the whole perpetual virginity thing and all the crazy stuff that actually isn't in the Bible, but it's there, whatever.
Well, they hold Mary
that she remained a virgin for the rest of her life and stuff. Do what?
They hold Mary as a deity or something of that nature. The Catholics do, don't they?
Well, not a deity, but they do hold Mary. They came up with something called the
pray or something like that.
Yeah, the language that they inherit, or that they kind of came up with, is this idea of what they call the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is that Mary remained a virgin for the rest of her life because Mary had to be sinless too, which is all based on very weird theologies about sex and the body and sinfulness. Like St. Augustine, for instance, who had a lot of great things to say, and as people in that time who, wrote down every thought he ever had, he had a lot of weird things to say, and so he actually believed that the sperm cell, he wouldn't have known it as a cell, he just called it the seed, actually contained the sin, which then he comes to call original sin, that gets passed down from generation to generation, which is why you have to baptize an infant to wash the original sin off. And then, which is really, it really is. So it's well, he was an interesting character. Anyway, but so those are weird things that we pile on. But once again, where did that come from, right? There's a cultural history that comes to that point, and fortunately, what we have in the Protestant tradition, especially as Baptists, is that we're called to come back to the text and talk about the text itself. And there's less of the baggage. I mean, we all have baggage that we're carrying with us, but theological baggage, things that your pastor told you growing up, things that you heard on the crazy radio preacher on the way in,
Just call it preconceived notion.
Yeah, preconceived notion. But what's, I think, lovely is that we are invited to come back to this text, and we're invited to hear the voice of the tradition of those thinkers, the fathers and mothers of the church, but at the same time, we're invited to interact with this text ourselves, right? So, anyway, let's continue on. Let's do it to 15, 1 through 21, with God's covenant, and let's read, let's just read 1 through 6. There's plenty to talk about. We're on appeal. Yeah, why don't we go back this way?
After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus.
And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir.
He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness.
There's this, interestingly enough, I think, when we're reading Abram's story back through the lens of Christianity, it's hard for us to pick up on this very important aspect of Hebrew theology, which is they didn't believe in an afterlife, right? They had this concept of Sheol, which is the underworld, which is a little bit more kind of like the Greek concept of Hades. It's not a place of like torture and punishment and torment. It's just where all of the spirits go to exist. It's kind of like the place where everyone's asleep, right? The underworld. And so they had more of this, so they didn't believe in a heaven or a hell kind of concept. And so in their theology and in their life, you really lived on through your children. You literally lived on through your children. And so if you didn't have children, then your history would be cut off and you wouldn't have a future. And so there's this, so what he says here is he says, you know, God, how are you going to fulfill these promises to me if I don't have any children? Because Eleazar of Damascus, a slave that was born into my household, is my heir. So are you going to give me a child? And so this gets to probably the most famous part of Abraham's story, which is the birth of his son Ishmael and the birth of his son Isaac. Ishmael is the son born to him by his wife's maidservant Hagar. When Abraham and Sarah get to a point where they become afraid that Sarah's not going to be able to have a child. She's never had a child at this point, right? And so the fear sinks in, and so she says, well, take my maidservant, Hagar, and then have a child with her, and that'll be your heir. And so she has her son, the son Ishmael. And there's this long, very complicated history that we're not going to be able to get into at this moment between Ishmael and Isaac. And so traditionally, Hagar is Egyptian, Abraham is Hebrew, and so Ishmael becomes the person who the Arab people and who the Islamic community looks back as their ancestor. So, and then and there's this and Ishmael and then Joseph is actually sold to Ishmaelite traders later on. And so you have this interesting history kind of embedded in the story that tragically becomes a violence that still kind of lives on to this day. Mm-hmm. And part of this is the kind of I just think a really bad reading of the story. A reading of the story where we think of these long, complicated, historical conflicts, and we take a narrative like this and we put it, and we read it through a lens and say, oh, this is just how it's always been, and this is just how it's always going to be. But I think that there's more to that. I think that there's so much more to this. And in fact, the story itself, Ishmael, it is a fault of Abraham's to send Ishmael away. It's actually this fault of theirs with how they don't learn how to reconcile this family together. And once again, that's where we see this moment of Abraham as this really complicated person. He's not perfect. But to be someone who God makes promises to, you don't have to be perfect. That's the whole point. God promises that this first promise of God's faithfulness and covenant is given to this person who is the least likely candidate for that work, which is pretty incredible.
But isn't that how that's always been with God? The least likely person does what you would never assume them to do.
Yeah. We see that throughout the entire biblical narrative, right? It just comes up over and over and over again.
Ivan Karamazov said, man is too wide. I would have made him narrower. He was talking about someone who had a wonderful side, you know, and the other side was, he couldn't reconcile those. His mind was messed up. And certainly that's where we sit sometimes. I would have made him narrower. He was good or bad.
Wow, that's interesting. Who said that? Who was,
It was Dostoevsky.
Oh, Dostoevsky. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the brothers. Yeah. Yeah. There's this. But that's what we're left with, right? Is the complicated nature of us. I always return to this story that I heard years and years and years ago of a young rabbi going to a much more seasoned rabbi, and he went and he said, you know, Rabbi, how can I be better? How can I be a good rabbi? How can I be a good Jew? How can I be a good human? And the older rabbi said, take 2 pieces of paper and write on one piece of paper, I'm a beloved child of God, and put it in your right pocket. And when you feel down and out and you feel like you don't matter, and when you feel like all you do is fall and fail and sin and make stupid decisions, pull that out of your pocket and look. And remind yourself, I'm a beloved child of God. But on the other piece of paper, right, from dust I came, to dust I shall return. From ashes I came, to ashes I shall return. And put that in your other pocket. In that moment when you feel like you're riding high on the horse and you're better than other people and you can feel that pride swell inside of you and you look down on your brothers and sisters and your neighbor with contempt, pull that other piece of paper out of your pocket and remind yourself that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. It's both of these parts of us as humans that we see in this first person that God makes this promise to. That both Abraham and Sarah are flawed and frail human beings. But just like Dennis said, he said yes. God can't really do anything with perfection. Because if you think you're perfect, you probably don't think you need anything anyway. But God can move mountains with a willing heart and an imperfect soul. Well, that's the Abraham story. Dennis, will you?
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all for it, and thank y'all for welcoming Nora.
Thank you for being here too. I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank y'all. Have a great day.
Oh, yeah.
I was trying to steal my name.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Okay.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Well, where's the,
Under the car.
under the car? Okay, thanks. Let's go through these prayer requests, and Brian, you asked about Ken. Who took food earlier? Because, okay, somebody has a report. I've emailed Ken, but tell me.
So when we went over Thursday, so it's been several days ago, and he was up and about, but not moving well and feeling very wiped out. At that point, he was not supposed to go back to the doctor until like this week, was a week away. And yeah, so.
Okay.
Yeah, it was I think it was 2 weeks after his surgery before he went back. And I think this next week is, isn't it 2 weeks in?
Yeah.
It was the 16th, yeah.
Well,
So that'd be Tuesday.
I was telling the class, some of the people that got in early today, Ken is not used to having someone help. He grew in a tradition he grew up in. I mean, he was self-reliant, and he was blown away. In fact, when I asked him, can we do anything to help you, he initially said no. Then he emailed me back. He said, maybe I was premature on that. Let's, if the class can help, bring some soup, whatever. I would appreciate it. So he's very much blown away by the response, and in fact had to call Kay and I off on that because he had family in this weekend, and said they will take care of the food on that. But thank you, the ones that brought that. That was very nice of that. Others on the list, Bert and Diana Truax, both now have the flu, and so they are indeed a repair. Diana emailed me last night and said they are just not doing well. And do we have a report on Linda? How's Linda doing? Linda goes. You mentioned last week. I think she had the flu.
Oh yes, I think she's back in action. She
Okay.
She had gotten Tamiflu, so,
Okay.
and she emailed me this week. So.
Okay. All right.
How long have Bert and his wife been down?
I don't know the answer to that. I just know that she said last night that they were in the throes of it right now.
Okay.
That she said it's been around. I don't know if it went through her school and she got it and brought it home or whatever. But,
Yeah, the paper said it's making a second pass.
Yes, and he hasn't peaked yet.
Yeah, type B. this
Same
time.
flu or different?
Different
It's
flu.
type,
That's
yeah,
great,
different.
type B.
Yeah.
A came for.
Oh, okay. She said we've been hit hard with the flu last week and this week. So tell everyone in the class.
Well,
so.
one probably had it last week, one
Yeah.
had it this week, you know.
So there's that one. We have a prayer request for Henry Foster, rehab and surgery. I guess Laura and Karen
He's
take care
going
of
to
this.
have surgery in 2 weeks. He is the man that we prayed for last week who has severe back pain and has had 4 surgeries on his back in the past. And he's frail because he has had leukemia. And so anyway, they're going to try to do 2 weeks of rehab to make him strong enough to have the back surgery.
I see. Good. All right. Please pray for my parents' house to sell, Diana. So that's they're really going to do it, huh?
Oh yeah, it's been on the market since like the end of October, which is really depressing because it went on the market at that time. So they've had a lot of people look, but nobody.
Nobody yet.
Where did they live?
So y'all got
Where did they live?
Richardson.
Just,
Richardson, and they're in Plano ISD. So
Okay.
it's not like it's a bad school district,
Yeah.
you know. If you know anybody who loves to golf, there's a putting green in the backyard. So.
Okay.
And you know, I'm ambivalent about this because when they sell it, that means they're gone. But
Yes.
it's kind of a strain now because
they're
they're
moving
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. And then Brian's brother found out that he has an aortic heart valve problem. I'm very worried about that. Is he in town, Brian?
He's in town, he's only 60, and it just kind of sprung up. His last physical, he was fine, and then this time, the doctor said it's moderate to severe aortic valve regurgitation, which usually leads to some type of surgery, and he's terrified of heart surgery.
No kidding.
So,
Yeah. Is there anything else we need to add to our prayer list here that I don't know that?
This flu deal is just really bad. Every time my son calls for mother, I have, Mom stay in, don't go anywhere. I mean, he has been overwhelmed, I think, and he's a radiologist. It's not like, he said, you know, they had a 32-year-old guy die in the emergency room.
Good.
With the flu.
And he didn't have any underlying, they get sepsis, is what is happening. They get pneumonia or a sinus infection from the flu, and yeah, it's.
Well, Robert tells us a story as we were getting started this morning that in China, before he left, there was a town that just got, the whole town had the disease, and the train quit stopping there, and that's how they had to isolate the whole town.
That's the way they did it during the black plague. People left the cities and went out into the country. And one guy, whoever it was that created calculus, that's where it came from, because he's sitting out there without anything to do. And he's crazy until he comes up with all these weird ideas.
That's a good story.
And every time I took a test, I
cursed the black
plague.
There you go. Well, let's pray then, and then let's go. Thank you so much for being here today. Dear Father, we thank you for this day, the time to come and study your word. We appreciate the time and effort that Kevin put into the lesson today. Thank you for speaking through your word to us today. And help us as we go forward with that information. Father, we pray for Bert and Diana Truax as they are battling the flu. Help them to get back to their normal health and to return to us. We're thankful for Linda Golzer getting better from the flu as well. Father, we pray for Henry Foster, who needs to get stronger before he can have back surgery for the 5th time. Be with him, help him to gain strength, and those who love him and care for him as they medically treat him. Father, we pray for Diana's parents that their house might sell in Richardson. That it's a mixed blessing for Diana, but if that's the decision, then help that to work out for the family. Father, we pray also for Ryan Rollins' brother as well, as he's found with the aortic heart valve problem, that he might be able to realize the situation, and if surgery is needed for him, to not fear it, but to face it and to be able to recover from that. Be with Brian and his family as they deal with this, that a good resolution might come from that. Father, we thank you for Wilshire. Thank you for letting us be your hands and feet in this part of the world. And I we pray. Amen.
You already been?